You're listening to Digging Star Wars, the online journal of the films that inspired George Lucas to create the Star Wars saga. Hello and welcome to Digging Star Wars. I'm so excited because today we're going to talk about Lawrence of Arabia and one of my favorite directors, Mr. David Lean, and the connection to Lawrence of Arabia to Attack of the Clones. I have our guest, Mr. Peter Fay, anxiously awaiting to share all his juicy tidbits of information regarding Lawrence of Arabia. And just to give you some background on Mr. Fay, a longtime friend of mine who is also a Temple University graduate from the radio, TV, film department, the arch rival of University of the Arts, I might add. He's worked for TV Guide writing weekly reviews. He's also been an extra in such classics as Blowout, Trading Places, and Witness. And most importantly, he is the creator of Soundtracks, a podcast that is a celebration of movies and movie music. And you can listen to Reel 24 of Soundtracks on YouTube right now if you search Soundtracks Reel 24. It's an awesome podcast and certainly inspired me to get up off my arse and get things moving for Digging Star Wars.
Well, thank you, Chris Mitch.
What makes Lawrence of Arabia so great?
And I'm really happy to be able to talk a little bit about Lawrence of Arabia because it's a film that has a lot of personal meaning for me. When I was a kid, back before the time of VCRs and cable, my dad took me to see this film in a theater in Havertown, Pennsylvania, and the Brookline, and I was dumbfounded. It was massive and huge and hot and unbelievable, and there was an overture and an intermission. What's an intermission? Why is the film stop? So it was an early exposure to kind of, even then, in like maybe 1970, 71, a dying part of filmdom. The film itself won 7 Academy Awards. It was nominated for 10. This is 1962. Best Picture, Best Director, Best Art Direction, Best Cinematography, the great Freddie Young. Best Musical Score, Substantially Original, Maurice Jarre, as Mr. Spielberg says it. I always thought it was Jarre. I don't know. Best Sound, John Cox, and Best Film Editing, Anne V. Coates. And I left her for last because I think it's significant that in this film there is not a woman with a speaking line, and yet it is cut so wonderfully by Anne Coates, who, just in case you don't know who she is, here's some of the other films that she cut. The Horse's Mouth, the only film that Alec Guinness ever wrote, by the way. Tunes of Glory, also starring Alec Guinness. The Eagle Has Landed, one of my childhood favorites. Ragtime, and The Elephant Man, among many others.
Wow.
A couple other things I can tell you about it. It was an influential film, and I asked myself, okay, why? I know everyone knows about it, won a lot of awards, but one thing that I learned was that it literally was filmed in a part of the world that had never appeared on film before.
Wow.
So, people were seeing many of the actual locations for the first time, and of course that presented just challenges that they could never envision. Mm-hmm. How to move the cameras, how to keep the flies away from the screen. There were flies everywhere, and they just had guys standing with water bottles around the cameras, spraying all the time.
Yeah, it was 115 to 125 or 135 degrees.
Yeah, I read one thing was 130, and they said even the locals were wilting in that heat.
Right.
They don't know why they were out in it, and they showed this part of the world that had never been seen by people. So when a high school guy named Steven Spielberg is going to the movies in Phoenix, he immediately identifies with the desert, and especially when Lawrence describes the desert as clean.
Yeah, which is great. I know this sounds like the cranky old film professor, but when younger people are watching this movie, they need to constantly remind themselves this is a pre-CG world. There's not an artist in an air-conditioned room with a computer painting those hills and painting those mountains and doing that landscape. And that was also, not the railroad you commentary here, but that was something, too, that watching it again, I'm like, my God, besides being a master of the straight cut, the film is just so well laid out and staged. He was willing to sit on a long shot for forever and it did not take away the emotional impact.
Right. And one of those shots, and probably one of the most famous shots that, and Spielberg talks about it, is the camels coming through the desert, and it looks like they're walking on air.
Yes.
It looks now like a CGI shot,
Yeah.
but it's real. And it's a film that took influence from one of our great directors, John Ford. Lean supposedly watched The Searchers before this to try to figure out some things, and indeed there's one or two shots that echo The Searchers, just as there are shots in Lawrence that pop up later in the Star Wars series. Obviously, George Lucas was influenced by this, Sam Peckinpah, Scorsese, all these guys, and Spielberg, who summarizes his assessment of the film as a miracle.
It truly is a miracle. I was reading a short review about David Lean's work, how Lawrence was truly a turning point, because up to then it was more personal drama pictures, and it was more tight quarter shooting. He went from, great expectations and stuff like that to miles across the desert, shooting two camels, meeting up after they've been through hell and back, and it really was a segue.
Yeah, and don't forget that Lean and his producer Sam Spiegel, this was the first film they made after Bridge on the River Kwai.
I think it's just obviously it's an amazing film. Not to kind of rehash what you said, but I have a similar experience. I was introduced to Lawrence of Arabia via my father, and I think that's something that their generation just wants, to be remembered. They want it to be a film. They want it to be a film that is remembered. I know our generation gets a lot of poked fun at for it, but like we're kind of forcing it on our Star Wars on our kids. We don't want it to get lost. So what's the connection to Attack of the Clones? Well, there's a real obvious common thread. Once you hear about it, I know when I first saw it and heard about it, I was like, I cannot believe I didn't initially pick up on that. And it has to do with a location. In the end of the first act of Lawrence of Arabia, there is a scene where there are three officers speaking. Are they all officers? There's Allenby and Brighton. Is Brighton an officer? Yes, Brighton. And who's the other gentleman?
Well, the other one is Mr. Dryden, Claude Rains.
Thank you.
And he's a politician.
Thank you. And they have just met with Lawrence, and Lawrence has made a kind of a list of demands. Like if he's going to carry on the campaign, he needs these things to go back and help the Arabs. And they all agree to it. And then they walk away, and they walk down this beautiful corridor with columns, and the viewer is allowed into this world that Lawrence and the common soldier is not, where you hear the politician and the men in power discuss what they're actually going to do. Are you actually going to give him all that stuff? He's asking for ammo and weapons and all kinds of crazy stuff. And they're like, no, we're going to give him what we can give him, and that's it. And the shot is this, the camera's in front of them walking towards camera, and it's dolling back. We cut behind them, and that beautifully shot scene and very telling scene was shot on location in Seville, Spain, in, I hope I'm pronouncing this right, the Plaza de España?
Plaza de España.
Thank you. It's an iconic scene. Of course, its placement right before intermission really kind of hammers it into your head. That same exact location was used in Episode 2, and it occurs right after Padme and Anakin land on Naboo. Once they decide Padme should go to Naboo and hide out until they figure out what's going on with the death threats and the attacks and whatnot. And it's a similar type of shot where the camera's in front of them, and Anakin and Padme are in the foreground, and R2's rolling in the background, and they're rolling towards camera, and then you kind of cut and you see more of the landscape, more of the architecture, and it's absolutely beautiful. Of course, it's plussed with CG and made to look more like Theed and other places on Naboo. But it is very telling, because I agree with you in that when you watch A New Hope, you can see how Lucas was inspired to shoot the desert. And there's I would say more of a coincidence than a direct influence, but it's great that you have Alec Guinness, who plays Prince Faisal in Lawrence of Arabia in the desert, and here he's Obi-Wan in the desert again. But when you see the scene in Attack of the Clones, it really hits you visually that I am directly referencing Lawrence of Arabia.
Yeah.
And it's something that, I don't know about you, but it hit me like a ton of bricks when I saw them side by side.
Yeah.
when I made the connection, when I discovered this connection of using that same corridor from the location in Seville, Spain, it really hit me like a ton of bricks that at first I didn't initially pick it up, but then it actually happened. And I think like that's pretty much what digging Star Wars is about. There's certain influences and then there's coincidences and everything else. But like when there's a direct reference, it's my inner geek. But like I really get excited about that. And like, what was your feeling when you kind of made that connection?
Well, the cool thing about it to me is that it is a real world location, and Lucas very much shoots it near identical. I mean, he frames it a little tighter, and I think he's pushing to the right a little bit,
Yes.
so that you can,
Especially on the reversal.
right, and that enables him to put the CGI in to make it, to make it feed.
Right, right.
The thing I love about it is that building itself is like a Moorish revival style architecture that, the British they're the creatures from another world.
Yes.
and then you've got Lucas putting it actually on another world and adding his little touches to make it less
Right.
earthly, I guess. It's a beautiful little touch, and it's so nice that it's straight ahead that anyone, people who are much younger than us will see these films before they see Lawrence of Arabia, but when they see it, they can go, I know that place, I know that
Right.
shot. And I love that. And there's other little things that I think are going on in that scene, and I may be inventing a little bit here, but I don't know. You had spoken about how Allenby, in the scene right prior to that, he's promising the world.
He's promising the world to Lawrence, and though it's a committal, it's a non-committal. Like he's walking around the courtyard, he's picking up drinks, he's putting his coat on, he's adjusting furniture, and Lawrence is like, "And I'll need this."
Yeah.
Yes, you'll have it. And I'll need this. It's actually not to jump Lucasfilms here. It's a lot like the scene in Last Crusade, where he's like, "You'll have this, and you'll have tanks." It's like almost the opposite of that. Like the one guy's like giving him the world, and then Donovan's just like, "Great, thanks."
Yeah.
And all that. Now that they're committing, Lawrence is desperate to get the supplies he needs, and you kind of read Lawrence expected a bigger fight, not a blanket. Sure, yeah, whatever you want. You want that too? Okay, great.
Right, because I think it's at about that time in the film that they're not outright questioning his allegiance, but he's gone away a Brit and he's come back.
Yeah, they're wondering if he's gone native.
Yeah,
and to think of all the crap they gave Lawrence when he entered the British building, the British officers bar, about getting a glass of iced tea for him and his Arab friend who just came through hell. Like they just came through the desert. Like getting a glass of iced tea was difficult, and now he's talking to the head honcho and he's asking for, a militia, and he's shocked how easy it is.
I thought there was a little similarity too in the slightly absent way Anakin is. Padme's going on and on about the Queen asked me, how can I say no, blah, blah, blah. And he's kind of like, oh, yeah, well, they need you. They deserve you, blah, blah, blah.
Right.
And all the while, I just think he's thinking about that leather teddy. Because he hasn't seen it yet. But he's a Jedi. He probably willed her to wear it.
I agree with the conversation because, we obviously talked about that scene prior to doing the podcast together. And Anakin, he's just thinking about her. He's not, he could care less. Well, I mean, it's arguable whether he really cares about the politics or not. But what that conversation is, again, they're talking about they wanted Padme to serve a second term as queen and how they're going to alter whatever the Constitution or whatever they call it on Naboo. And this is purely just a sweet little irony. But that building, that was the building in Lawrence of Arabia and also in Attack of Clones, is a civil service building now.
Mm-hmm.
It's used for like the local township and whatnot. So it just kind of added like another kind of hidden layer of, it's really cool that they're having that type of conversation in that building, because where else would you have a conversation like that but on the steps of the courthouse or the steps of the city hall? And that's what that building is. And that's what's great. It's kind of like that buried history that Star Wars has, where they don't have to hang a sign on everything explaining what it is. It's just a characteristic, and it has that feel, and that's what's kind of cool about using that location, in addition to the nod to Lawrence.
Yeah, and I think the one thing that occurred to me while researching all this, and it's simple math, but Lawrence was only 15 years before Episode 4, Star Wars.
It's astounding.
So, if you look at the Episode 4 as sort of a revival of the serial and all things that were, great about going to the movies in the 40s, 30s, whatever, it's not that long before, but yet here he is. He's paying homage to it in a. Well, I'm talking about episode 4 now. I know this is not episode 2,
Yeah.
but it didn't predate it by that much, and just how much of an impact it had. That film was made. The studio system was still there, but by the end of that decade, it wasn't really.
Mm-hmm.
But these guys, the young bucks, they knew a good film when they saw it and borrowed from it.
Yeah, no, I mean, if you're gonna steal from something good, right? So one of the other things I thought was interesting, and this is, the reason you're here, Peter, is to call me on the carpet on this. If this is pushing it, first act of Lawrence of Arabia, he has to go back to British HQ, right?
Mm-hmm.
So he takes his 2 servant boys, the Arab boys, and they go through the desert. And as you mentioned, the one, they try to save him, but he dies via quicksand. So they get to British HQ, and the guard greets him up at the front. And he kind of warns Lawrence not to take the Arab boy in with him. Okay?
Right.
So they go, and of course Lawrence is in his
Your
Arab
droids.
dress.
We don't want droids in here.
No, I'm not going there. No. He's in his Arab dress, and the boy, of course, they both look like crap. They've just been through the desert.
Right.
So they go in and they pass a desk in this atrium on their way to the officer's bar, or whatever you want to call it. And the one at the desk says to the boy, I don't know the exact line, but I do know this word. He calls him Mustafa. Where do you think you're going? And that's Mustafa. It's also sometimes spelled PH. But he calls him this, and, Lawrence is the whole, he's with me. And there's that little argument, and it goes on. And when I heard it, I was like, what? It sounded so much like Mustafa, I almost jumped out of my seat. So, of course, I rewound it, I put subtitles on, and I paused it. And I spelled it, and then I went and looked up. And, I thought, well, maybe this is just pushing it, But when you look up the meaning of Mustafa, what this British person called the Arab boy, Mustafa means chosen.
Huh.
Not only that, it's a relatively unpopular Arabic name.
Okay.
And I thought, oh my gosh, they just went through hell, and they've gotten here, and he's being called this. And it reminded me, well, not reminded me, but it was that's what Mustafa is. Mustafa is hell. Anakin has to, the chosen one has to go through hell, and then blah, blah, blah.
That's some good sleuthing, my friend.
Luke is, he's an anthropology guy. So, I can see him really digging deep, and, that's perfect to name that
See
planet.
what you did there.
Yeah. I know you stumbled across some other things with the connection between Lawrence of Arabia and Attack Clones. Why don't you talk about them now?
Well, I did, and it's, as you know, I do a little podcast called Soundtracks that's tens of people have heard, and
I've listened to every episode twice.
And thank you, and if you think of Lawrence of Arabia, the score, Maurice Jarre, at the time he was not very well known, and he was actually the third choice to do the score. He had 6 weeks to create and record 2 hours of symphonic music. And he ultimately won the Academy Award for it. But more than that, it's become this iconic score. The main title, the sweeping melodic main title, it is almost synonymous now with cinema. Mm-hmm. Not unlike some of the things that John Williams did with Star Wars, whether it's this main title or the Imperial March.
Think of the Academy Awards.
Academy Awards. What do they play?
They played Lawrence of Arabia, and they went right from that into Star Wars.
Yeah, and they pretty much do that every year, and rightly so. I mean, it's hard enough to create a score that works, but to make something, I guess sometimes everything just comes together. In Lawrence of Arabia, it truly is a miracle, like Mr. Spielberg said. But I want you to just have a quick listen to the very first things we hear in Lawrence of Arabia. This occurs in the overture over a dark screen, and it goes like this. Okay, so those are some very ominous tribal drums.
Yeah, I mean, what a thing to hear, right as, it's starting. That's pretty
gets your
intense.
attention.
Yeah.
So jump ahead 15 years, and there's a track from episode 4 called Land Speeder Search, Attack of the Sand People. And here's a little segment of that. Now,
Wow.
I think I'm not saying Mr. Williams needs no help from anyone composing wonderful
Yeah,
scores,
but
but
he
it
borrows
makes
too.
sense. It
Yeah.
makes sense that if this film is inspired in certain ways by Lawrence, the music should draw from that as well. And again, keep in mind, 15 years before,
Yeah.
Jarre created a definitive type of music for desert scenes.
Absolutely.
Almost now maybe to the point of cliche because it's done 60, 70 years later.
Right.
But, you can't argue with the sweeping melodies and the grandiose nature of it. It's just fantastic. In episode 2, which is what we were talking about here,
Sure.
there's a little bit more of this tribute, although oddly enough, it occurs on Coruscant, and the track is Zam the Assassin. It's a little more subtle,
Right.
but it's still there.
Why do you think Coruscant? Because obviously in 2, they're going to go to Tatooine.
Yeah, I think it's a good question because I listened again to the Tatooine stuff, and given the nature of why he's back on Tatooine, you listen to that music and it is very mournful.
Yeah. And one thing, too, this just literally popped in my head. To that effect with music and Lawrence made it very clear that he loves the desert in Lawrence Arabia. I mean, he loves it because it's clean, whatever. And Anakin makes it very clear that he hates the desert in Attack of the Clones. When they're taught, when Padme's talking about we used to swim out to the island and lay in the sand and try to guess what birds were singing, and Anakin's like, I hate sand.
Yeah.
Gets everywhere. It's coarse and blah, blah. It's not like you. And he starts, sneak a grab. But it's just it's so funny how, direct opposite they are in that regard.
Yeah, well, but amazing, too, that how the Star Wars as a whole and Lawrence of Arabia could have such influence in visual aspect of cinema, but also the audio aspect by two of the greatest soundtracks ever.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Well, Chris, thank you very much for having me.
Oh, you're welcome.
It's been a joy, and I really wish this was a video podcast because I don't think people fully appreciate the level of detail that you go to in preparation. And if they could see you rocking that white Princess Leia gown, oh my God.
We're not supposed to talk about that. Well, no, I want to thank you. And for those 3 people listening to Digging Star Wars, you really should give soundtracks a try. Talk about a lot of work and research. I mean, every episode is just chock full of information. It's a great listen, and it was definitely inspirational in getting my podcast together. So I'm honored the fact that you took time to do this, not only do the research, but also just sit down and record.
Been my pleasure.
And I hope you join us again in April. You check back to see our podcast then. We're actually going to switch it up a little bit, and we're going to do a review of Clone Wars, starting with the film and the 3 seasons. So please come back and listen. And one final thought. Do you know which famous actor was originally considered to play Lawrence of Arabia prior to Peter O'Toole?
I think Marlon Brando was in the running for that.
You are good.
I think he turned it down. I can't remember. Who else? Anybody?
I just got Marlon.
Yeah, Marlon Brando. Sure. Come on.
All right.
If you made a film from 1950 onward, your first choice was Brando.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, well,
I can see
again.
Terry Malloy in the desert, though. That'd be pretty cool. I got your camel.
All right, thanks again, everyone, for listening. Please come back and listen to our next episode in April. And, if you're so inclined, please post a comment.
Digging Star Wars is produced by Mitch Media and has no connection to Lucasfilm Limited whatsoever. Copyrights for films, trademark characters, and related materials discussed in Digging Star Wars remain with their respective owners. For a list of references or source material, please send an email to diggingstarwars@gmail.com.
Hey, Gassim, I got your camel.